So this Ford Hall Forum lecture is the way that we advertised it appealed more to the abstract topic that it deals with, which is the relationship between the concept of a nation's unity and individual rights, which is a whole interesting philosophical discussion in its own right. But it's, as with many Ford Hall Forum talks, as with many Ayn Rand lectures and essays generally, she is looking to make an abstract philosophical point against the backdrop of the current cultural events, cultural and political happenings of her day. And the occasion for this speech, she's giving it in 1972, is what is then the upcoming, she's giving it about a month or so before the November election of 1972, which is a contest between George McGovern and Richard Nixon. Nixon, of course, is running for re-election. He's been president for about 4 years at this point. I suspect that many people watching right now, especially if they're younger, they might know a little bit more about Nixon, but not very much about McGovern. Certainly people like me who weren't even born when this happened would have to have done some background reading to find out more about this guy, especially because it was a landslide, and it ended up being a landslide victory in favor of Nixon. He won 49 states, which is almost unprecedented. And so McGovern doesn't have the reputation of a great winner in political history, and that's maybe part of the reason why people don't know so much about him these days. But I think you may know more about, you may, I don't know if you remember this election, but I know you wanted to talk about the meaning of the McGovern campaign to Ayn Rand and what this election meant to her based on what she says here and in some other works.
No, I was an infant, so I don't remember it firsthand, though I was alive. But I think to get the wider context of why she's focused on this issue, and I think including the more theoretical aspects that come out in the talk about what national unity properly consists in, you have to think both about what is going on culturally that is grabbing everyone's attention, and then Ayn Rand's particular perspective on what's going on culturally, including the McGovern campaign, which she saw as reflecting broader cultural trends. So if you're thinking late 60s, early 70s, she's writing a lot about cultural political issues. And they'll come out a book, The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution. And so she's writing about the phenomenon of the New Left. In these Ford Hall Forums, she talks about the first talk she gives is the intellectual bankruptcy of her age. And that's a theme that runs through the talks, that we're in a period of, so the US, America's in a period of intellectual bankruptcy. And she views the New Left as a symptom of this, that the old left has collapsed, the old left that preached socialism, communism, and this as a way towards progress and a great future that would be economically prosperous, but also more generally socially, it would be, you're supposedly going past capitalism to something even better. And when that worldwide, but including in Western countries like in the UK, when socialism's tried and it fails economically and it fails at a cultural level, that it tears countries apart and the countries descend into more warring factions and groups. The old left as an intellectual force collapsed, she thought. And what it was morphing into was the new left, that they're abandoned the whole idea that we should be for economic progress and we should be for a prosperous nation. And if you think of the US and the hippies, the culture, the clashes on campus and so on, it has a real atmosphere of, you could put it as disunity, as now the US is gripped by warring factions, there's battles in the street. So there's a real question of, like, what has happened to the national unity in the US? That I think this is the reason she's talking about the theoretical underpinnings of it, because it's a real question that people are struggling struggling with. In the early 70s, there's flights from the cities. People feel like this is disintegrating into group warfare in some kind of way. They don't understand it. They don't understand why it wasn't always like this. And so she's trying to shed light on that. And for the McGovern campaign in particular, she views McGovern, and she wrote about this. It's not center stage, though I think it's certainly between the lines in A Nation's Unity in this talk. But she wrote about, she views the campaign as he's the candidate of the new left. And he's not a very inspiring candidate. He's not charismatic. But this is part of the bankruptcy, she thinks, of the left, that it's no longer a crusading ideal, but it still has morphed into something more vicious. And one of the ways she puts it, so this was in an article this is in August 1972, so a few months before the talk. And she talks about the Democratic National Convention, and it's a takeover by the New Left. And this is just a brief paragraph, her description of it. There was one significant factor in the grotesque spectacle of the Democratic National Convention. McGovern's candidacy is a declaration of war on the American people by America's intellectuals. And that's obviously very strong language. But so it's a declaration of war on the American people by America's intellectuals. And McGovern's the stand-in for that, or the candidate of these new left intellectuals. And that's where she's placing it. Now, obviously, you can argue, is she right about that? But that's how she's viewing him. And I think it's important to get her reaction to this whole campaign, and her attitude towards Nixon as well, given that this is what she thinks of McGovern and the meaning of the campaign.
Yeah, one other thing I found interesting about her earlier article, this is the one that's called A Preview, where she's discussing this 72 Democratic Convention, something that relates again to, I think, the student conference that we're having in the fall, is that she sees it as a turning point in another regard from old left to new left, which is, the way she puts it, the switch from economics to physiology. Rather than trying to build a coalition with labor unions, which was the old left, classical Marxist strategy, they're instead trying to divide people based on pressure groups, based on minority status, ethnic status, sex. This is the kind of gender and racial tribalism that has now really become the leitmotif of that whole end of American politics, if not all of it. That's something we're going to be talking about at this conference on tribalism. And it's interesting, too, because McGovern in this regard is himself sort of a transitional figure. You mentioned that it represents the breach between the intellectuals and the ordinary people. I mean, McGovern himself is a kind of intellectual. He's a history professor. He wrote a dissertation on the labor movement, the history of the labor movement in the Colorado mines. I think he did it at Northwestern University, and then he taught as a professor in South Dakota for many years. She makes a joke at one point in the talk about how he's not a real intellectual, and neither are the people who claim to be intellectuals today. But I mean, in some important sense, he is, and that's got to have something to do with the way in which this is the breach between the intellectuals and the public is deepening. Here you have an actual, college professor trying to become a sort of philosopher king, but interestingly abandoning his own roots in old Marxism and the labor movement in order to generate these kinds of tribalistic ethnic constituencies. And she discusses in that same article about how different members of different groups get showcased on stage, and how labor, and she talks about it again, I think, in A Nation's Unity. Labor gets sidelined, and labor ends up, not endorsing the Democrats this year. And there's a whole other separate conversation I think we could have about her view of labor and how that movement has moved on. But I also wanted to raise the issue of, you mentioned, Onkar, that You have to look at the context in which it looks like national unity is beginning to break down in the late 60s and early 70s. And you have to judge what she's saying about national unity against that background. And I definitely agree. I thought it was really interesting in this lecture, the way that she tries to assess McGovern's prospects for building national unity, not only from a philosophical perspective, but from what some would regard as a simply kind of journalistic perspective of looking at the way he runs his campaign and the way he runs his convention. So the more philosophical point, and this is something we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about later, is the idea she sees the key to national unity as respect for individual rights. And that's, I think, to some people a little paradoxical sounding, and that's why we'll talk about it more later. But the essence is that she thinks people need to be able to respect each other's space if they're going to cooperate in a peaceful and civil way. And McGovern has proposed all kinds of policies that she sees as abridging and violating individual rights. And so that can't be a possible basis for uniting America. But at the same time, she also makes observations about how he conducts himself and how he conducts his campaign and the convention, that even if you didn't have this philosophical perspective, you'd have to think, how is he going to get national unity this way? Because on the one hand, for one thing, she says he changes his mind all the time. He changes his policies all the time. She's commenting on shifting policies about various kinds of redistribution schemes. First, it's one kind of amount that everybody's going to get, and then it's another, and he lowers it after criticism. And she emphasizes the kind of unity, the kind of agreement he wants is just, in effect, agreement on the basis of faith, and whatever he says, whatever he changes his mind to, that's the kind of unity that he wants. And also, she notes how he has worked to divide his opponents against each other, not to mention in the earlier essay how she thinks he divides the different political constituencies against each other. And then after he's insulted them and after he's called them names and made a big deal about various scandals that they're involved in, he expects them to get together at the end on the stage and lift up their arms and hold hands together and call for national unity so that the party can be unified and we can all get along again. And and she's basically implying, if this is his idea of what it means to get people, make people get along, woe to us if we vote for him, and this is the way that he runs the country. And I think this is a kind of observation that we can maybe later on see if is this relevant to anything in politics today.
And she makes a point about how most of the other candidates who are sort of bewildered that they've lost to this guy, do join in the call for national unity. So they do sort of get behind it, maybe not enthusiastically, but they sort of get in line. And that's not a good thing.
Now, the other thing that you have to, I think the other important piece of historical context to look at when thinking about what she's talking about in this lecture is the alternative that she's dealing with at the time, which is Nixon. And this is, of course, 1972, and there are several things that have happened during the Nixon administration. Now, she had earlier also endorsed Nixon in 1968 in a very reluctant way in his contest with Hubert Humphrey. But she was never much of a fan and made that clear earlier. And in the period between 1968 and 1972, wrote a number of different articles commenting on his policies, both foreign and domestic. And Onkar, you'd noted that there was a question in the audience, or kind of a heckler's question at one point to this effect. I think it was about the wage and price controls.
Yeah, it's she comes out again. This is in her newsletter. So the Ayn Rand letter that she's writing at the time, and that the nation's unity. This talk goes into it, becomes an article that I think it's dated October 9th, 1972. She has commented previously in the Ayn Rand letter that because of her view of what the democratic National Convention, what it represents, what their platform represents, and what McGovern getting the nomination represents. That it's, as I quoted, she views it as a declaration of war. That she comes out, she puts it, I'm an anti-Nixonite for Nixon. And both are important, that in this contest, she's supporting Nixon, but it's, at this point, you can't even describe her as a lukewarm fan or something like that. She's an anti-Nixonite. And I think one of the significant things that I think the questioner is right to ask about, he was a little, I wouldn't ask it in that kind of way, just shouting it out, but it's if she views McGovern, one aspect of him, as a power luster, and it relates to, Ben, what you were bringing up, that he wants to be accepted on fate. And hand me power, I'm not going to tell you what I'm going to do with it, or I'll give you all kinds of contradictory things. I'll change my mind every 5 seconds, but give me power. And she does not view Nixon as a power luster. And one of the like a very strong counterexample that you could give to that, or an objection to, well, is that the Nixon administration has imposed wage and price controls, or a wage and price freeze across the American economy. And she writes on the article is The Moratorium on Brains, which, and a deliberate linking to a similar situation in Atlas Shrugged. And she brings up, as she often does, like, how could she be prophetic? And if you understand the principles at work, it's not that hard to make these kinds of predictions. So the Atlas Shrugged has where the bureaucrats and the people in power impose this kind of freeze. And the Nixon administration has done it. And you can ask, like, isn't this an incredible grab for power? And she has an interesting perspective on it. She says, in the abstract, that a country in which a government official, or in here a president, can do this thing, can wield this kind of power, is no longer a free country. When she's analyzing the whole meaning of this, so she has a very, very negative attitude to the imposing of wage and price controls, this freeze, as it was put. But she doesn't view it as Nixon as a power luster. It's sort of, he's reluctantly, bumblingly doing this. She views him as a through and through pragmatist who, if you can talk about sincerity for someone who doesn't have principles and so on, he thinks that what he's doing is pro-freedom, and it's like Bush. We have to I forget exactly the words he used, but something like, we have to violate freedom in order to preserve it. And Nixon, it's the same kind of rhetoric. And she thinks, again, in the way that you can, to the extent that you can talk about someone who is unprincipled on principle as having any kind of stand, or she thinks he's sincere in that. And so it's not a naked grab for power, though it's really, really bad and really, really ominous that the presidency can wield this kind of power. And it's part of the reason, I think she'll then later put it, she's an anti-Nixonite. It's not like she's lukewarm to him. This is really bad, but yet he's not a power luster in the way that she views McGovern and the whole meaning of the McGovern campaign.
Now, of course, the other big event that's going on against this in the background here is the Watergate scandal. Now, that's something that initially started in the campaign season 1972, when Nixon's operatives were assigned to bug the McGovern campaign, basically, because Nixon thought that they had dirt on him. He wanted to get dirt on them. It's a long and tawdry story. Now, interestingly, the Watergate scandal, even though the first news about it was before the election, even though it was already being discussed at this time, from what I've read, it didn't end up being a big factor in the election. And I think that was, probably because people at the time didn't know if this story had legs. They didn't know that it was going to pan out, that there was going to be a scandal that went all the way up to the White House. It was still in the process of being investigated, both by journalists and by the legal system. I can't even remember if there was a special counsel at this time yet. But when she's writing about Nixon, she obviously doesn't know how high it's going to go. Even later on, after Nixon's elected, it turns out he didn't really need to get any dirt on McGovern. And even when she's writing critically about Nixon, even when she's writing critically about the Watergate scandal, and she wrote several articles on that scandal, she's doing it without assuming that Nixon's necessarily implicated. And for good reason, because we didn't really know. They didn't know until basically somewhere between March and July of 1974 that Nixon had a hand in this scandal. March is when he gets basically indicted, and then July is when the tapes come out showing that he's the one who basically ordered this whole procedure. And then shortly thereafter, he resigns. You do get a sense in her later writings increasing souring on Nixon. So in August of 1973, for instance, she does a lecture on another Ford Hall Forum lecture on censorship and on Supreme Court decisions on that. And she mentions that right after Nixon won in 72, she had hoped that maybe some of his Supreme Court picks would be some of his few saving graces. But then these same justices that he's appointed end up making really bad decisions, abridging free speech. And so she has second thoughts about that. And then later, as late as March of 1974, you see her in her Philosophy Who Needs It talk, using Nixon as the example of the arch pragmatist who thinks that, what's true today isn't true tomorrow and we can change with the wind. And she still doesn't say it at any point, I don't think, that he's a power luster. But you have to wonder if she had known earlier how much and how deeply involved he was in these various scandals, whether she would change her mind about that. And one thing we know is that one of the scandals that he helped orchestrate was the sabotaging of various campaigns on the Democratic side. He helped to spread basically rumors that were baseless about this Muskie guy who was running as a Democrat. And that's part of the reason that he ended up dropping out. So if Nixon isn't a power luster in politics, I don't know who is. But of course, she didn't know that. And given that she didn't know as much, the recommendation she ends up making, vote for Nixon rather than McGovern, in spite of Nixon's many flaws, it's hard to take issue with when you look at all the things that McGovern's doing and proposing. And yeah, Nixon's got a lot of bad stuff too, but it's a choice between the lesser of two evils. So Nixon's the lesser one. And most of America, 49 states, ends up agreeing with her about this.
I think let's talk a little bit more about the power lust, because you can use it in two kinds of ways. And I think this is important, thinking about the lessons for today as well. I think what the Watergate revealed, what you're bringing up, is it reveals a real corruption, and a corruption of the office. And there's an issue of power in regard to that. I'm above the law and that aspect of it. But in thinking of it, and particularly I think in thinking about it in terms of electing candidates, it's what do you think there's limits on the power of the office, not sort of in the background that I'm doing nefarious things that I don't want anyone to know about, but that you're doing out in the open and saying, give me this power. And McGovern, that he's going to expropriate everyone's income above $12,000. That's not, oh, well, they found out it was a year of reporting and they found out that that's he's openly saying this this is what my candidacy is about, not it's shameful that this is, and that when you're getting that level of legitimately grant me power so that I can wield power, because what I want is to wield power. It's power lust at a level that's politically really dangerous. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and relates to some broader themes in Rand's analysis of culture, where she often sees the scandal as out in the open and not behind the scenes. And I've been working on a project on that's coming out soon.
So should we, let's see if we have any questions.
There's one from Facebook about Nixon. Didn't Nixon also sabotage the Vietnam peace negotiations in 1968? I don't myself know a lot about that topic. Do you?
I mean, I've read a little bit about it, and there's a lot of these kind of scandals in the background, both about Nixon and about Kennedy, actually, in regard to Vietnam. So, but I don't know enough to. So I've heard that there's allegations like that, but I don't have enough to.
One thing that this reminds me of is something that she comments on in the lecture, I think in the Q&A, because someone asks, what do you think of Nixon's foreign policy? And the first thing she says is, well, would you first please tell me what it is? And this is indicative of the fact that she regards him as a pragmatist in foreign policy just as much as in domestic policy. And here again, it's interesting that she starts out with a somewhat rosier view of him than she ends up having, because when Nixon goes to China to meet with Mao, she writes an article that I wrote a little piece on earlier this year, where she says, she condemns the meeting as an act of public diplomacy, but she acknowledges, well, if we're going to be making deals with Russia, we might as well also make some kind of deal with China if we can play the two of them off against each other. But in this lecture, she says, well, that's what she had hoped Nixon might be trying to do, but he didn't succeed, and has ended up, I guess, she's referring to the fact that he's kowtowed again to the Russians in a way that, there's no grander scheme that he's trying to achieve, even in his realpolitik kind of pragmatist way. And I don't know how that fits into his work on Vietnam, his policy on Vietnam, though it is useful perhaps to point listeners and readers to the Lessons of Vietnam lecture, which she subsequently gives, in which she indicts all of the presidents who've been involved in this. Okay, so maybe we should talk now about the broader philosophical issue that comes up in this lecture, which is the concept of national unity itself. And I think when I first read this lecture many years ago, the thing that I found the most interesting and surprising about this, having at that time read a lot of her other work, was that she deigned to consider national unity a valid concept at all. Because, she's well known as a critic of collectivism. She's well known as a critic of nationalism. She believes that only individuals are real, that the protection of individual rights is the only valid purpose of government. And so I was surprised that she didn't just, because what I would have done in my younger days at the time is just say, national unity, who cares about that? I'm an individualist. But that's not what she says. And what she ends up saying, I think, is rather informative and enlightening. Do you want to comment on that at all?
Yeah, let me comment on a wider aspect of it, or looking at it sort of from the perspective of a nation as an achievement. And then you can talk specifically about the issue of individual rights and why she thinks of that as the fundamental principle here, and in thinking about national unity. But she does not at all have the kind of libertarian attitude, or what would become a libertarian attitude, of that the creation of a nation, the creation of a government that advances or helps advance the interests of the citizens of the nation, that is either unnecessary, so that's certainly not her view, or easily created. So she views the creation of the United States as an enormous achievement, and underscore enormous. It's an enormous achievement. It's the last great achievement of the Age of Enlightenment from her perspective. And it's one of the greatest achievements of the Age of Enlightenment. You get, for the first time in history, a nation created on the basis of political principles. And created doesn't just mean there's the Declaration of Independence and then everyone went home to their farms and then it's just all a bunch of individuals. It was, how do we create a new nation, which means a new federal government, and what is the structure of this government? How are we going to ensure that it stays within its proper limits and doesn't become, because they know full well there are power lusters in their age, there's going to be power lusters in the future. How do you prevent a power luster from being able to impose wage and price controls, for instance, across the whole economy? So you need an elaborate structure, you need a constitution, you need to think about law, and you need to think about the whole evolution of this. And this is what the founding fathers did. So they fought a war of revolution, but that, I mean, in itself of itself is a great thing. But if they didn't also then the American Revolution is won, what do you set up now? And the setting up is a complex achievement. And it's that achievement that led to a kind of national unity in the US that she thinks exists, I think, for the first time in history. And in another way that she put the McGovern campaign she put it's the declaration of war against the American people by the intellectuals, with him sort of as a unattractive figurehead. Another way she puts the meaning of his campaign, it's at war with the principle of individual rights. It's dedicated to eliminating the last remnants of this principle in the US. And because she sees that principle as that's the key to national unity, it's very significant, her negative evaluation of McGovern. It's not about him as a person. It's about what the phenomenon represents, and it's the destruction of an enormous achievement.
I think it's important here, first of all, to address this question about how do you fit individualism and national unity together, to think a little bit more about what a nation actually is over and above individuals. Because there are certain things she says in other contexts sometimes that make you think if it's fair to say there are such things, because she'll say things like society is nothing but individuals, only the individual is real. And there's an important point to that, which is that individuals are the basic reality. Only individual particulars exist generally in metaphysics. And but that doesn't mean that there aren't new interesting relationships that emerge among individuals, and that those relationships can't be defined by a common legal code and a common culture. I mean, obviously, we are not, as individuals living on desert islands, we're not atomistic individuals, which is sometimes the straw man view of what individualism is. We live with each other, and we don't just live in kind of separate little groves, out in nature. We live in a society where we trade with each other on a regular basis, and we have, social relationships and intellectual relationships, and we need legal relationships with each other to protect these other kinds of social relationships. We need there to be a central agency that objectively defines the terms of operation and how it is we're going to relate to each other if we want to live in a peaceful form of coexistence. And this is part of why she stresses in this piece that when you're talking about national unity, it matters what kind of unity you're talking about, under what terms you're going to coexist with people, and not any old terms will do. As she illustrates, if the terms are that you get together in a meeting every month and the largest and most vocal group gets to vote on what to do with the other members of the society, this is not peaceful coexistence. This is living under a kind of gang rule. And, she illustrates that this is how too many people have lived in society for far too much of history. And so it is a, comparatively rare thing that suddenly someone's figured out a way, after thousands of years of learning, to manage peaceful coexistence in a way where no one has to sacrifice to anybody else. And these trade relationships and intellectual and social relationships become win-win. And I mean, so that, the basic union, the basic kind of unity there is a unity of winners, people who, it's not a lose-lose, it's not a lose-win relationship it's there's the possibility of trading value for value in every realm is enabled. I do think it's interesting also that you pointed out it's not just a matter of writing the Declaration of Independence and going home. Even that, though, was quite an achievement, as she acknowledges in the lecture, that if it's ever proper to kneel, one should kneel when one hears the reading of the Declaration of Independence, because this concept of individual rights is so new in human history, and nobody even started to get even a glimmer of it until maybe just a few hundred years prior to her giving this speech, and then before that there was nothing. Do you want to say anything more about what you think it took philosophically for this concept to develop, such that it was such a novelty and an innovation in the history of philosophy, and also why people to this day still don't understand it, which is a point that she stresses, including people like some of these libertarians that you mentioned, who think that they're defenders of this concept, but then who don't seem to mean what she means by it.
Yeah, I mean, that's a discussion that could be a whole other webinar to discuss all the things that go into it and why it's such a radical concept. One of the aspects is the idea, and to go to the individualism aspect of it, to sort of really highlight that, is this idea in the Declaration of Independence about the pursuit of happiness. And it's the pursuit of the individual's own happiness. And that, from a moral perspective, that's what political organization is about. So what you're trying to create is a system in which the individual can pursue his own happiness. That's a radically new idea morally. It's expressed in political terms. And the way Ayn Rand would put it is that the founding fathers are political revolutionaries. They're not moral revolutionaries. But that, to understand that, one needs to understand there is a new radical moral perspective that is implicit in the Declaration of Independence, and what the sort of the philosophical tragedy and why the anti-American forces could regroup, and you can get something that eventually becomes the new left that's at war with this idea, is that it was only implicit, that the pursuit of the individual's own happiness, this is what the system is there for. It exists in order to make that possible. It was much too implicit in moral terms and so easily overturned. And in thinking about the individual's pursuit of his own happiness, he's got to be able to put it in kind of the social aspects of it. He has to be able to, when he agrees with people, to embark on joint projects. And when he disagrees with people, that people can go their separate ways. And it's enormously difficult to figure out, how do you get a system in which that is possible? And the concept of individual rights is a solution. In part, it's a solution to much more than that. But that's one of the aspects that it's addressing. That if your rights are protected, you can operate in a sphere where your judgment rules. You can think for yourself, you can speak, and you speak your own ideas and find out if people agree or disagree, and whether you actually have common goals and common aims or not. You have the right to earn what you produce and then trade it with people if you can find willing partners. So it gives you an enormous freedom. So her view of rights is that they're protections of your freedom of action that you should have if you're going to be able to pursue your life and happiness. So you have an enormous freedom of action, but so do other individuals. And that allows you to have all kinds of different agreements about all kinds of things with individuals. And the way she puts it in A Nation's Unity, man's not a social animal, he's a contractual animal. And rights make it possible for him to contract in all kinds of different ways with all kinds of different individuals. And vice versa, it makes it possible for them to contract with you. And so it preserves that, but because you have this whole sphere, if you can't reach an agreement, if someone's offering a job but you don't like the terms, either what it pays or you don't like the hours, you can go your separate way, or you can reach an agreement, a mutually beneficial, as you put it, as a win-win agreement. And that this is, so she puts it in the talk about peaceful coexistence. This is what makes possible, both that no one, if you want to hire me, no third party can step in and say, well, no, the wage is too low, or we don't like the hours you have to work. There's got to be some maximum beyond which, I mean, there's all kinds of laws like this that it would interfere with your and I legitimate contractual relationship. That she views as breaking legitimate national unity. And the other, that if it's, let me take McGovern's thing, that would just take everyone's property. So no one has any rights, and that's not peaceful coexistence. And if you're in a realm where either people want to interfere with legitimate agreements or want to take away your freedom, such as your freedom to earn and keep the property you've created, you will look for gangs within your nation to form to try to weigh. And in effect, I mean, and this is how she describes the mixed economy is a civil war between it's a legalized civil war, so it looks civilized, and it's like a civilized civil war. But that's you, and she spends a lot of time in A Nation's Unity talking about this. You don't even realize it, but you're trying to form all these groups. I'm the old people advocating for Medicare and Social Security. I'm the employees joined unions and advocating for, far from viewing that as like that's an aspect of unity. She views it as that's an aspect of disunity. So it's a very
I find the discussion, you mentioned her view of man as a contractual animal. And I found that discussion interesting, especially from the perspective of the emphasis that she puts on the necessity of looking to the long range for peaceful coexistence. Because, of course, that's what contracts enable. They enable long range planning. And the kinds of mixed economy, welfare state kinds of policies that someone like McGovern's proposing are ones that make contractual agreements, especially in the long term, very difficult. And that's one of the major factors that disunifies a nation, that dissolves it into this kind of pressure group warfare, civil warfare, even a kind of gang warfare. And that, I think, is a really interesting one of the perspectives that makes her view especially unique and very distinctive, say, from the sort of libertarian view, because it's one of the points that helps her express the idea that there's a lot more in common between collectivist statism and anarchism than you might have otherwise guessed. And that as the state becomes more overbearing and goes beyond limiting its function to the protection of individual rights, it must necessarily sacrifice one group to the other, which pits the groups against each other and begins to create this kind of low-grade civil war. And her view is that if it left unchecked, it becomes actual civil war and actual warfare in the streets. And this is something that you see in Atlas Shrugged. And I was thinking, while listening to this lecture again this morning, the discussion that she has here of the feudal system and how this system that's devised basically to deal with the anarchy that came after the collapse of the Roman Empire, it's not too different from the kind of competing governments view, so-called, that that libertarians propose. And it's also something that you see happening in a book like Atlas Shrugged as the government becomes overbearing and pressure group warfare mounts, especially toward the end. You start to see people dividing into actual literal warring camps where different feudal lords are trying to take over the power station or the Project X installation so they can have a little fiefdom, protecting one gang against another. And this is a really important and underappreciated aspect, I think, of her philosophy. And I should plug Greg Salmieri's essay in the Companion to Ayn Rand, where the one about a philosopher and her times, where I think he brings out a lot of her commentary on this issue over the course of the 20th century. You also mentioned, Onkar, the point about how the moral philosophy of the founding of America was implicit, that there was a political revolution and not a moral revolution. I think that connects also to some things she says at the very end of this talk about the American sense of life. She talks about how part of the reason that they're voting against McGovern and for Nixon is because ordinary Americans who've been alienated by the intellectuals, they don't see themselves as a rabble in the way that the intellectuals do. They don't want to be the object of somebody's pity. And she thinks that this kind of pro-American sense of life, which she's earlier discussed in that lecture, Don't Let It Go, is one of the things that's responsible then for the election of Nixon. And that's something she then expands upon in her later letter, The American Spirit, talking about the election of Nixon. But obviously, she doesn't think that it's enough for a philosophy to be implicit. And she doesn't think that sense of life is enough to maintain a nation or its unity or its commitment to individual rights. And that's something she stressed in Don't Let It Go. And I'm sure that she thinks it's true here. Do you want to say anything more about that and about her her reasons for thinking that sense of life only has this limited power, why people need philosophy, and what it means then if in later years we've not gotten more philosophical and only have our sense of life to carry us?
I mean, this is a theme that runs through the Fort Hall Forum talks and that runs through Ayn Rand's writing, certainly post Atlas Shrugged, is this gulf between the American people and the American intellectuals. And she has this focus on the intellectuals because she views it as a crucial profession. So her first nonfiction book is For the New Intellectual. And it's urging that this profession of an intellectual is a crucial profession. It has had crucial positive and negative impact on the course of Western history. The intellectuals have turned against, you can put it against the Enlightenment, against reason is how I think she fundamentally looks at it. They've become mystical. And in Atlas Shrugged, you've got the mystics of spirit and the mystics of muscle. So the intellectuals have turned against reason and its foremost expressions, which are, you can put it industrial capitalism and America, including technology, and then deeper than that, science, which she views like the new left, the anti-industrial revolution. She talks in the Fort Hall forums about it's anti-technology, it's anti-science, and it's anti-man and anti-mind. And this is her view of what's happening with the intellectuals. And what should be happening is she views the intellectuals as a proper profession, is you should be the voice of a culture. And you should be helping people understand what is going on and integrating their observations. This is the way she puts it in a preview. So this is 2 paragraphs after she says that McGovern's candidacy is a declaration of war on the American people by America's intellectuals. Then this is her view of intellectuals. So it's not that long a paragraph. Quote, The intellectuals serve as guides, as trendsetters, as the transmission belts or middlemen between philosophy and the culture. If they adopt a philosophy of reason, if their goal is the development of man's rational faculty and the pursuit of knowledge, they are society's most productive and most powerful group because their work provides the base and the integration of all other human activities. If the intellectuals are dominated by a philosophy of irrationalism, they become a society's unemployed and unemployable, close quote. And her view is that, unfortunately, that what has happened in Western culture in general, in America in particular, is that they've adopted a philosophy of irrationalism and have turned against all the achievements of the West. And in the face of that, the sense of life is sort of the remnants of a better past, because a better past means better ideas, but particularly better ideas entrenched in the culture. And this again is, she views a nation and a culture as a real thing having real impact on individuals who live there. So for the American sense of life, it's formed out of the whole revolutionary period, the ideas there, the taming of a new continent, and this whole long-range focus that you brought up, which is very important because her perspective on the Industrial Revolution and of America sort of going from a backwater, economically speaking, to the leader of the world economically and the most powerful economic nation, is she views it again as a consequence of adopting the principle of individual rights, which allows people to plan long range in a way that they had never before been able to, and plan in a business sense, in a scientific sense, in a technology sense. And that you see all that emerging in the 19th century in a way that it's not even foreseen, certainly by all the founding fathers, but it's not even clear if any of them see exactly what's going to happen with the US. But because they've made it possible for people to think and plan long range, you get such an enormous explosion of productivity, of creativity. And all of that is part of the American spirit, I think she thinks. It can be, I mean, the spirit can die if the longer we live in a mixed economy, teetering towards statism, the less there's a cultural atmosphere that pushes the distinctively American attributes. And what is required is intellectuals to name those attributes, help people understand them, help people understand the meaning of them, help people integrate them into a worldview that is coherent and consistent. And absent that, you can get rebellion, but you can't get positive creation. So a way to put it in terms of history, maybe, is the American, that you rebel against the yoke of the British. That's possible, I think, even at a sense of life level. But a sense of life can't create the Constitution. It can't create the new government. That's all explicit ideas, explicit principles, and an explicit worldview. And absent that, the American sense of life has a certain potency, but it's minimal in terms of thinking of the long-term direction of the country if its intellectual stature stays what it is.
You know, it's interesting. One of the things that this lecture has in common with some of the other ones that we've looked at is that it manifests her attitude of taking ideas seriously, thinking about what it means to act on them in practice. And one of the ways that she often does this in lectures like this is she sketches little fictional accounts of what it means to do this. There was a lengthy one that she did in the anti-industrial revolution. There was a shorter one in the one on living death. A few others, I think. And there's another lengthy one in this one about what it would mean to live in a society that doesn't protect individual rights, where basically people's lives are voted on by different gangs. And toward the end of it, I mean, it's being told from the perspective of one person. She says, think about whether you would want to live in this kind of situation. And the person that she's speaking to is, it sounds like sort of your ordinary Joe Q accountant, middle American sort of guy. And the way she describes it at the end is that, various groups have imposed upon him. They've taxed his wealth. They've limited his economic opportunities. He suddenly starts to feel grievances against them. And at the end, he, as a man with no future, he starts to act like the type of man he's despised, becomes sloppy and quarrels with his wife, and hears a seedy lecture declaring that Horatio Alger stories are a myth, and cheers and finds that he's joined all kinds of groups, but decides that at a certain point he fears and hates other people for what they've imposed upon him and what they've reduced him to. And I mean, I think this is an interesting description of what could happen to somebody who starts out with this sort of American sense of life, but who, without any intellectual guidance, is left with nothing but the CD lecture at the group meeting, and left with nothing then but anger to feel against the other people that, rightly or wrongly, he feels have oppressed him, and that's. You could look at what he ends up doing as a kind of rebellion in the name of the American spirit, but it might be that there's not much of the fumes of the intellectuals of the founding fathers left over, and that all he's going on here is just leftover resentment and emotion. So that, I think, raises some interesting questions about our contemporary political scene, and what the state of the American sense of life is and its relationship to politics. But before we talk about any of that, I should say we will be wrapping this up in 10 or 15 minutes. So if anybody has any general questions at this point that they'd like to ask about this lecture or about related topics, I think now is a good time to plug them into the Facebook chat or into the Zoom chat, and we can start to consider them. And while you are thinking about a question you might want to ask, I think we can get started talking a little bit about the contemporary political scene and how some of what she says here might apply to it. And Onkar, one of the reasons I thought it would be interesting to talk about this lecture, apart from some of the philosophical issues that we've discussed, is that I have often heard and read people online arguing that Ayn Rand would have endorsed a vote for someone like Donald Trump on sort of the same grounds that she endorses a vote for Nixon, which is to say, yeah, he's not perfect, he's a pragmatist, he's got all kinds of inconsistencies, but you can't expect a philosophic perfection from a political candidate, and when it's a choice between the lesser of two evils, the obvious thing to do would have been to vote for Trump over someone like Clinton. And then when the American people voted for Trump, what this kind of argument usually, the way it runs is to say this was again the American spirit and the American sense of life, which has this implicit value for liberty, triumphing over European style collectivism and the intellectual elites. I mean, there's certainly, I think, a veneer of plausibility to that kind of argument, but I think it's worth discussing how far those parallels run, especially in light of the context in which she makes that recommendation for Nixon. And she is an anti-Nixonite for Nixon, as you mentioned. Do you want to comment on that at all?
A couple. I know you want to comment as well. A couple of things. So one is this issue of voting for the lesser of two evils, or supporting the lesser of two evils. I think it's important to get what she said about that kind of issue. So we'll talk about this. This is a topic for the next webinar in regard her attitude towards Reagan and the fact that she did not vote for Reagan. She did not vote for Carter. She did not vote And one of the things she says is there's a limit to the principle of voting for the lesser of two evils or supporting the lesser of two evils. And it's also interesting the way she describes her support for Nixon. She does not put it as in that it's a lesser of two evils. This is what she wrote at the end of a preview. She says, quote, "I am not an admirer of President Nixon, as my readers know, but I urge every able-minded voter of any race, creed, color, age, sex, or political party to vote for Nixon as a matter of national emergency. This is no longer an issue of choosing the lesser of two commensurate evils. The choice is between a flawed candidate representing Western civilization and the perfect candidate of its primordial enemies." And both are important. So her view of Nixon, that he's not a power luster, there's a level of corruption that he has not descended into, I think, from her perspective. Now, again, you can argue that, is she right about Nixon in regard to that or not? But she's viewing him still as a civilized force versus McGovern, who she thinks of as a spokesman or a figurehead of the new left, and the sort of figurehead it deserves and warrants, given that it's no longer a crusading ideal. It's what you would expect them to have. But he represents the new left, and think again of the title of her book, The New Left, the Anti-Industrial Revolution. It's not just some bad ideas. It is people who are aligned with a motive to destroy the U.S. And in that context, you can't vote for that candidate. You have to vote for someone who's still pro-American, even if everything he does is anti-American. There's still some sense in which he's pro-American. And the other candidate, there's no sense in which he is. And I think so. It's a very special circumstance that she thinks is going on, why one should support Nixon. And you should be anti-Nixon and still supporting him. And in the election of Trump, whatever one can say about Hillary, I don't think you can view her as she's the spokesman or figurehead of the intellectuals. I mean, Bernie Sanders would be closer to that than Clinton. So I think it's a very different context, and it was a very specific and unusual context in which she's urging people to vote against McGovern. And she doesn't, and it didn't even apply to Reagan, Carter.
Yeah, I mean, I think the key question in thinking about whether there's a parallel between for Nixon and a vote for Trump is who the alternative is. And there are lots of big differences in someone like McGovern, like Clinton. As you mentioned, I mean, I think Bernie would have been a better stand-in for McGovern if he in the election, but he wasn't. And is a representative of this third way view in the Democratic Party, which is people like McGovern lost, and they lost bad, and so we need to find a way to reconcile our collectivist views with the fact of American capitalism, which they say an inevitable fact, but you know they're about that. But and you might argue it was worse that Hillary was worse in this regard than Bill, but there's some big differences. Another thing that I thought really struck me reading the lecture is that many of the same kinds of character traits that she condemns McGovern for and that she sees as decisive in favor of a vote for Nixon. What are some of these character traits? Changing his mind and his policies all the time. Reducing campaign to the level of personal insults, pitting one candidate against the other, and then even after sowing all of this discord, making a disingenuous call for national unity and the request to be given power because only he can I mean, these are all the same kinds of, these are all true about Trump. And so this is not to say that Trump is as bad as McGovern in every respect. But at the same time, I mean, if she thought this college professor was childish in the way that he changed his mind and insulted other people, what would she think about this, about Trump? I mean, none of this is to say, I don't think that what I'm trying to say is that there's no rational grounds that somebody could have for wanting to vote for Trump in 2016. All I'm saying is that the parallel between a vote for him and a vote for Nixon, I think, is dropping the context of her reasons for endorsing Nixon at the time. And I can imagine somebody wanting to vote for Trump, especially if their industry has been targeted by the previous administration, by Obama, and it's likely that they're going to be targeted by Hillary Clinton again. Like, say, if you're someone in the energy industry, I can understand that vote. I think there can be good reasons for it. But then I think it's important somebody who makes that vote thinks about what they're doing, and what they're doing is they're now joining a pressure group. They're joining one of these competing factions, and it may be that they don't have a choice about that's that things have gotten to the state where that's what they've been reduced to. But even when you make that decision, it would be important to have the same attitude that she has about Nixon, that you become an anti-Trumpite for Trump, which means then, okay, you have a reason why you voted for him, but you're going to then continue to critique him from the perspective of the principles that you think are necessary for national unity and for the protection of individual rights. And so that means then, not jumping on the bandwagon on whatever he says and saying this is great because it's Trump and he's going to save us all. That's not an anti-Trumpite for Trump perspective. That's just really joining the tribe and not doing it out of any protest, but, basically becoming a tribalist thinker politically. And that's one of the things we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to be doing a talk about at the student conference in November.
And to go back to something we talked about, or that I talked about, in terms of thinking about McGovern and how he fits into the wider trends. So it's the wider intellectual trends, but it's also the trend of what is happening to the Democratic Party. And it's one of the ways it's put in the sort of a subtitle in the Ayn Rand letter. It's the new left takeover of the Democratic National Convention and the platform. And she's writing a lot about what the trend among the liberals and the left is, and then how it's manifesting itself politically. And there's something similar going on in her view of what's happening to the Republican Party. That is something similar in the sense that she's thinking of it across time and across decades of what happened. And when she writes about Nixon, she talks about, well, Eisenhower was the first. People think of if you vote for, she puts it something like a semi-conservative, that at least slows down the process of moving towards more statism. And she writes, no, that's not what happened. It's not what happened with Eisenhower. It's not what's happening with Nixon. It's not it's not the right way to think about it. When she talks about the Reagan administration, part of her and the Reagan candidacy and the meaning of it is, what is this doing to the Republican Party? What is the meaning of this? What is the meaning of him going now out of his way to kowtow to religion? So and sort of the basest form of religion, the so-called moral majority. So what is the mean, and what is it across time that this is going to mean? And I think part of her perspective on Trump would be, or at least part of what one should think about in regard to Trump and the Trump phenomenon, is what is it doing to the Republican Party? And you talked a little bit about she talks about the better Democrats who now McGovern's calling for, now you got to get behind me, and this is what unity looks like, and so on. And even though they vociferously disagreed in the campaign with it, and they're better, they were right to disagree with McGovern's incredible statism, most of them get behind him. And you see a similar phenomenon happening, I think, with Republicans in the way even critics of Trump then get behind him. And it's like they've done 180 degrees and you wonder what has happened to them. And if you again think about the just average American, can you take this seriously? And can you take it morally seriously and intellectually seriously? And that is an important perspective. So her perspective is not just on the candidate as a candidate, but the candidate in the wider meaning of the party and of the culture. And I think that you have to have that perspective if you want to try to think of how she's thinking about things in looking at politics and candidates and so on.
We have a couple of questions that have come in on Zoom. Do you want to address either of these, or would you rather talk about that political involvement topic that we were thinking about?
I haven't read the question, so maybe you should decide.
Well, Sam's question about whether the story at the beginning of the talk about the man living in harmony with his neighbors, whether that reminds one of the story in Atlas Shrugged. And I think that relates somewhat to some of the things we were talking about earlier. Yeah, I mean, I think you're talking here about the bum on the train, Dagny talking to Dagny, recounting the story of the 20th Century Motor Company and how he joined on with the 20th Century Motor Company plan that collectivized the factory, and at first thought that he was basically joining a club that would help him out, but then various kinds of demands end up being put on his time and his money, and he becomes jaded and he starts to hate his fellow man. Yeah, I definitely think there are strong parallels there, and we can think about whether that man or the man in the story, is that the man today who's voting for politicians to do the kinds of things that they're doing today? Are they doing it out of an American spirit, or are they doing it just out of resentment and hatred for perceived enemies? Interesting question. I don't think we should address the other question, so maybe it would be good to wrap up with the question about political involvement. You pointed out, Onkar, that in the Q&A session, there was somebody who asked about the importance of getting involved in politics, and her answer I thought was interesting. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I can comment on an aspect of it, and it relates really to the theme of the talk and some of what you had brought up, Ben, that it's a nation's not just a collection of individuals who can do their own thing and no one's actions have any repercussions on anyone else's actions. It's an integration. And the question is it properly integrated and it's peaceful coexistence in which each individual can pursue his own happiness? Or is it a bad integration that makes people in a nation or a country at loggerheads with each other, and it's not peaceful coexistence, even though sort of from the outside you might think it is. It's actually a sort of semi-civilized civil war. And because that's what a nation is, you should be really, really concerned with everything going on politically. This doesn't mean you have to get involved into politics or run for office and so on. But a responsible citizen should have views about what is going on, should have views about what would be proper politically and what wouldn't be, from the perspective of his own individual life and from his own pursuit of happiness. Now, you can make too much of it and listen to the news every morning and get depressed and use it as an excuse not to do anything and like, woe is me in a world that's not perfect. And we certainly don't live in a perfect world politically. And that's wrong. I mean, that's clearly wrong. But so is the alternative to say just that politics is dirty and ugly, so I'm not going to concern myself with it. It's impossible for the direction of the country to change if the better citizens do that. And if the better citizens get involved in just talking intelligently first understanding and talking intelligently with fellow citizens about political issues, change is possible. That's a legitimate view of it being grassroots. And another aspect of it is a political system, what goes on in a nation that has, even if it's semi-free political system, is done in the citizen's name. And when things are being done that you don't agree with, you should, I think from a moral perspective, be vocal about that. That doesn't mean just running around in your neighborhood or whatever and shouting what your political views are. But it means voicing them when appropriate in a rational way to try to make it clear, no, this is not done in my name, and there's a better approach. And then for the people who are willing to think about it, to articulate what a better approach would be.
The question from Vijay might be a good one to end on, which is asking about how much difference an election can make one way or the other, given that ideas determine the course of history in the long term. And some of what you were just discussing, I think, relates to that. You mentioned ways in which political involvement can make a difference. When it makes a difference for an election, can that make a difference too? I guess is what he's asking.
I mean, maybe you want to talk a little bit about this, Ben, because one of the things we discussed sort of outside prior in preparation for this is elections as barometers, and that she's interested from that perspective as well. So did she think that she's urging sort of the readership of the Ayn Rand letter to vote for Nixon? Did she think like this is going to turn the election? I think the answer is obviously no. She doesn't think that's going to happen. But they're significant from a variety of perspectives.
Yeah, I mean, I think often when people who have sort of niche political ideologies debate about politics, as objectivists do, that they sometimes do so with the mistaken assumption that when they're speaking to their small audience, that's going to move the election, that they have the power to move the election one way or another, or they debate as if they did. So, I mean, it's an interesting question whether an election can make a difference in the long run, but maybe, I don't know, I'm not enough of a historian to answer that question, but one thing I would say is, what if it does? What difference does it make? You only have one vote. Are you going to cast your vote because that one vote will change the election results? It almost never does. So why are you going to make this vote? It's probably not because it's going to make a big difference to the election itself. It's more because the act of voting is a way of expressing your values and fighting for your values. And of course, the vote itself is just one part of a broader kind of involvement in politics that you might have, where, it's probably much more important, what you do to speak out with your friends in conversation. You'll make a much bigger difference to the culture by defending your values in conversation than you will with that vote. You might change somebody's mind, who might change somebody else's mind. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of a perennial question. Who should I vote for? But even though it's important to think about, it's a lot less important than the kind of reasons you're going to give to people who ask you why you voted for whom you voted for.
And I'm wrapping it up with the election that she's talking about, Nixon versus McGovern. She thought, and she wrote after you mentioned the American Spirit, which is the article right after the election, and she thought it's important that it was a landslide for Nixon. But another way she'll put it, because there's not many people, she thought, who are really pro-Nixon or enthusiastic about Nixon. So it was a landslide defeat of McGovern. And in that sense, it's not just, well, did he get elected or not? It's that what became clearer in the country, and that it's important, so to put it as supporting your values, that what McGovern and the forces behind him what they realized is we don't have the support of the country at all. And Ayn Rand always viewed the new left and its sort of cultural manifestations like the hippies as fringe, small minority groups. They don't even represent college students, let alone the wider American public. And that this became clear, and that so many people voted for Nixon or against McGovern. It was really important that both the intellectuals feel like, yeah, the people, we don't understand the people, but they don't support us. And that the sort of the base of just followers was so much smaller than it was. That was really important for the nation. And in that sense, the elections have real significance beyond just who's elected. It's what happens in the election and why, and the aftermath as well. But it's easy to dismiss them as less significant than I think they are. They don't determine the course of history, but they're viewed as points of reflection. That is, to think about what is going on, I think, for legitimate reasons.
Yeah, it's certainly true that the McGovern loss ended up shaping the Democratic Party for decades to come in the kinds of candidates that it fielded, with the possible exception of Mondale. And that had real world implications for what the Republicans had to deal with. And it's worth thinking about, well, what is the election of Trump going to mean in the future when people think about what happens when you run a candidate like that? But we should wrap up. I think we're definitely out of time. So thanks everyone for joining us for this discussion. A quick reminder to please look at the poll that's in the comments section to indicate when you think the best time to attend webinars for you will be in the future. And a reminder that our final webinar on the Ford Hall Forum Talks will be next week, September 5th, on her talks about the Kennedy administration and the Reagan administration. Onkar will be back for that. Joining him will be Greg Salmieri, and it'll be at a new time, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6:30 p.m. Eastern. So thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thanks,
Onkar.